Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm honored to introduce Dan Whittle. He is a senior attorney with the Environmental Defense Fund and senior director for its Caribbean initiatives. He plays a leading role in Environmental Defense Fund's projects in Latin America and the Caribbean to promote sustainable fisheries and the conservation of critical marine and coastal ecosystems. Dan co-founded Environmental Defense Fund's program in Cuba over 20 years ago, and has been especially active in promoting scientific exchange and environmental cooperation between the United States and Cuba. He also directs Environmental Defense Fund's efforts in Puerto Rico to advance community-based clean energy and climate justice. Actually, I met Dan a few weeks ago in DC, and he had just returned from Puerto Rico and doing some work there. He has taught environmental law at the Wake Forest Law School and served as environmental advisor in the administration of North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, and practiced environmental, energy, and Indian law with the Van Ness Feldman, in Washington, D.C. He was also a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Fellow and is a fellow with the American College of Environmental Lawyers and serves on its executive committee. Thank you, Dan, for joining us.
Great. Thank you, David. I'm still kind of getting used to the technology here, so we'll just wing it. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. I was really hoping to be there on Long Island and just couldn't make it. So, but hopefully next time, hopefully you'll have me back. So I'm going to kind of jump into things. I want to leave some room for discussion. I'm going to share my screen. And great. Can everyone see that? Everyone hear me? Excellent. And
Yep.
First of all, I just want to say that some of you, but maybe not all of you, know about Environmental Defense Fund. If I was there in person, I would ask for a show of hands. Let's see if I can advance this real quick. There we go. But the Environmental Defense Fund was founded in 1967, thanks in large part to Charlie Worster, who's still on the faculty, emeritus faculty of Stony Brook School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. But Charlie and a couple other of his pals, including a high school biology teacher, got together to basically sound the alarm on DDT back in the 60s because it was affecting local bird populations, specifically local osprey populations. And so thanks to Charlie, and thanks to Stony Brook for having such a prominent role in Environmental Defense Fund. You know, almost 55 years later, we've grown from about 3 people to about 800 people, and we work all over the globe. Our mission is on the slide here, and it's really focused on a people-first mission, how to protect the world's natural systems in a manner that really serves people. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on EDF. It is available, on the web if people want to know more, or simply reach out to me. I really want to talk about sharks. And on Valentine's Day in 2015, I was part of a team of Cuban and American scientists who went fishing for sharks off the north coast of Cuba, setting out from Cojimar, which is the small town where Ernest Hemingway kept his boat near Havana. And specifically, we were hoping to catch a rare longfin mako, put a satellite tag on it, and then study its movements and behavior. This was all part of a Discovery Channel Shark Week show. Well, we got lucky. After about 10 hours of nothing but rough seas, a large adult longfin mako finally took the line and nearly capsized our boat. But in the end, the scientists and crew wrestled the shark onto the boat. It was quite dramatic, just long enough to tag it and let it go. So it turns out that longfin makos, and I'm sure many of you, have some familiarity with sharks and maybe work on sharks, but it turns out that makos are long distance travelers. After leaving Cuba, the shark swam the Gulf Stream to the Bahamas and then circled back to Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico, where it spent several weeks. It then headed out to the Bahamas again, up the Atlantic coast, reaching New Jersey in late June before swimming back south again. And the tag finally came off in the open ocean later that summer, about 125 miles east of the Chesapeake Bay. Longfin makos are highly migratory, and like many other species of fish and marine life, they travel freely across political borders. They don't need passports or visas like the rest of us do. But they aren't immune from the whims of politicians and policymakers either. What happens because of weak environmental policy in one country, like overfishing or marine pollution, can affect marine life, ecosystems, and livelihoods across the border, even if environmental controls in that country are strong. So this is particularly true for migratory sharks. Nearly 75% of all migratory sharks in the world are overfished or threatened or near threatened, largely because countries just don't do a good job of working together. So now we're gonna switch themes here, and many of you will recognize the massive BP oil spill off the coast of Louisiana in April 2010. It was the worst ocean oil spill in history, and for nearly 3 months, more than 200 million gallons of oil spilled freely into the Gulf of Mexico, wreaking havoc to marine life, ecosystems, and coastal communities far and wide. The oil spill spread out over 4,000 square miles, and it revealed really gross weaknesses in the industry's approach to safety in the US, and in the way that the US government regulated offshore oil drilling and sort of had plans to prevent and respond to spills. Now, Cuba was threatened by the spill and was on high alert for months. In fact, many Cubans believed that the spill was driving sharks to the shore of the North Coast, and people were afraid to go in the water. And so even though Cuba has some of the best environmental laws on the books, its hands were virtually tied when it came to protecting itself from pollution originating in the US. And what made Cuba especially vulnerable was the lack of contact and coordination with the US government. At that time in 2010, they had no effective way of communicating with US counterparts. They couldn't simply call the US Coast Guard and ask for information or help. Likewise, in the event that oil were to enter their waters, Cuba couldn't count on help from the US government or from private sector companies to help them clean it up, because of the US embargo and US law prohibited Cuba from accessing those services. As it turned out, a handful of NGOs like Environmental Defense Fund served as unofficial sort of back channels of information throughout the crisis. The Cuban government contacted us and asked us to provide them as much as we could about the spills movement. It took more than 18 months for the governments to find a way to talk about how to deal with future oil spills together. And those talks may never have happened had people in Florida not awoken to the fact that a spill in Cuban waters would be extremely dangerous to their ecosystems and livelihoods. And Cuba was in the process of planning for oil drilling. So it's never been any secret to Cuban and American scientists that our two countries are connected. And you can see it from this map. That's the Gulf Loof Current. We're only 90 miles away from the coast of Cuba. So scientists have been working forever, virtually, to finding ways to study that connectivity and to find ways to manage jointly. So even when it's been hard to get government permission to travel back and forth, scientists have persevered. It's been difficult to get funds and almost impossible to get field research. Nonetheless, that collaboration has occurred and continues to occur. The last 2 years of the Obama administration was a turning point. Cuban scientists could once again get visas to attend meetings in the US. US NGOs no longer needed to apply to the Department of Treasury for specific licenses every year, which was very cumbersome. Instead, they could travel to Cuba and conduct projects under the auspices of a general license, which basically meant you check the box to say that your project's qualified under the rules. Exporting gear, research equipment, and other materials became a lot easier to do as well during those Obama years. Government agencies, most importantly, started talking to each other again and began working together on a suite of environmental problems that we share, including climate change, overfishing, loss of biodiversity on land and sea, etc. Government and scientists from both countries and academic scientists from both countries even got in the water together. In 2017, a team of Cuban and American scientists spent a month circumnavigating the island, exploring Cuba's diverse deepwater coral reefs and discovering new species of sponges and marine life. And that was called the Twilight Zone expedition. I believe it was Florida International University. The Harbor Branch Lab in Florida was the lead with NOAA. So there's a lot of great stuff on the web about that expedition. But let's go back to the longfin mako. And since I know there are a lot of marine scientists probably watching, these are not longfin makos. In this picture, these are silky sharks, and I was somewhere just outside of the frame there. But though joint research on sharks had occurred before, we never would have been able to secure permission from either the US or the Cuban government to take satellite tags to Cuba before normalization of relations in 2014. This kind of technology would have simply been off limits. You see the satellite tag here on the silky. We also put some satellite tags on silky sharks off the south coast for that same Discovery Channel show. And several months after we tagged the sharks, some of these same scientists worked together with Cuban scientists to prepare Cuba's first ever National Plan of Action for Sharks, an ambitious sort of roadmap for rebuilding populations of almost 100 species of sharks in Cuban waters. Remember that there are about 500 species of sharks in the world, about 100 are in or near Cuban waters, and many of them are endangered. After the plan was published, shark experts from around the world said they were impressed with the plan, and it was one of the best they had seen. So as I noted, the BP oil spill exposed the dangers of not communicating and coordinating on shared environmental problems. In 2011, EDF partnered with an industry group out of Houston to bring a delegation to Cuba, including the former EPA Administrator William Riley, who is co-chair of the Obama's Oil Spill Commission. And then a couple years later, we brought Governor and Senator Bob Graham from Florida, who used to be a staunch pro-embargo politician, but because of the oil spill, he really believed we needed to work together. And so these non-official delegations really laid the groundwork for bilateral talks once Obama and Castro normalized relations. So the role of NGOs and industry groups is an important one, because it really sort of provides the foundation, for government-to-government talks. And between November 2015 and January 2017, the Obama administration and the Cuban government developed 23 bilateral agreements on all kinds of things, from migration to narcotics to agriculture. And the first two were on the environment. And out of the 23, about 10 addressed environmental issues. So the environment really plays an important role in the relations between the two countries. I will say that President Trump pretty much reversed Obama's policies, did not reverse the 23 agreements, but didn't do much to implement them. President Biden promised to reverse Trump's policies, saying they were inhumane, they were they hurt the Cuban people, but he's been slow in doing so. But we are seeing some recent changes. And David and I were in this event a couple weeks ago, and I talked to the State Department, and there seem to be signs that the Biden administration really wants to begin fostering this kind of collaboration again. So stay tuned. I think the midterms may have play some role in that. So I'm going to sort of switch to just several. I'm going to kind of go from recent history to why EDF is in Cuba in the first place. And for many of you in marine sciences, it's probably a no-brainer, but I just wanted to walk through a few slides. I also encourage anyone who's not been to Cuba, I know several of you have, but it's a remarkable place, both land and in the sea. And you'll see from some of these photos what I'm talking about. But Cuba is arguably the most important island in the Caribbean in terms of biological diversity. So much of it is still protected despite a suite of environmental problems. Cuba has a large, large area. It's the biggest island in the Caribbean. They still have a number of endemic species on land and on sea. It's home to some of the best preserved coral reefs in the Caribbean. Many of like elkhorn coral that you see in this photo have pretty much disappeared from places in Florida and elsewhere in the Caribbean. A couple of years ago, there was a report on the 50 most resilient reefs in the world, and 5 of those are in Cuban waters or partially in Cuban waters. So there's a real argument to invest in protecting, as coral reefs are dying around the world, to really focus on what's happening in Cuba. Also, they have an incredible marine protected area network. Back when we started working 22 years ago, almost none of the marine and coastal natural areas were formally protected. They had a pretty robust terrestrial system of national parks. They started in the late 90s to start mapping out which critical habitats to protect. We were part of that scientific effort. And now they're protecting over 25% of their so-called insular waters. And most of the marine protected areas have a marine and a coastal component. Collaboration is in our best interest. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with the State Department over the years where they really want you to walk through, why is this in our interest? Just explain to me why environmental protection, natural resources management in Cuba is important to us. And that, connectivity theme is not self-evident to a lot of people. The BP oil spill kind of illustrated that it was. For years we were talking about the larval transport of grunts, reef fish, from this southwestern coast of Cuba up the Gulf Stream into Florida, and those reef fish became targets for recreational and commercial fishermen. But it wasn't until the BP oil spill that a lot of people finally understood how connected we are. And the other thing about why collaboration with Cuba is important is Cuba's kind of a leader in the Caribbean and much of Latin America, for their science, for their environmental laws and policies, and for their programs. And so, by partnering with Cuba, you can have a much greater reach, beyond, in the region and in the hemisphere. They just, passed new fisheries law, which is one of the most progressive in the region. So it's these collaborations have a much greater reach and impact than simply, a bilateral. I put this slide up just simply to show a handful of the people that work on these collaborations. There are many more, and there are several, scientific institutions in the U.S. and in colleges and universities that aren't reflected here. But we work with the environmental ministry, with the food industry, with the University of Havana. We work international. There's a group called COSPE here, which is an Italian NGO, World Wildlife Fund. Netherlands we work with, and then a number of funders, Oceans 5, MacArthur Foundation, and Ford Foundation. I wanted to highlight the SOS Pesca project. About almost 10 years ago, World Wildlife Fund and this Italian group, COSPE, got a big European Union grant for sustainable fisheries and marine protected areas and livelihoods. And these 2 small communities off the South Coast, well, they recruited us because we were the fisheries people. And so in the course of a 3.5, almost 4-year project, we worked to basically bring fishermen together with government officials and scientists, something that doesn't really happen in Cuba much, to really talk about management issues, overfishing, and these local marine protected areas that were being degraded. And out of that came this nationwide assessment of vulnerability of species, basically stock assessments. It was a proxy for stock assessments, since they just lacked the data to really understand the condition of many stocks. But we were able to produce data nonetheless. We also were able to basically mobilize and motivate fishermen. These were a couple of our friends in one of the communities who got very involved and became very active. And it was really unprecedented that fishermen began having a voice in management decisions in Cuba. We also, before the pandemic, were running 2-week-long intensive university courses. EDF professors in Cuba and elsewhere, and professionals, not students so much, but professionals throughout Cuba would come to the course. We'd have fishermen, we'd have fishing sector people, we'd have government people, all in the same room, learning about fisheries management and developing fishery management plans together. We also, I think David Taylor may have sent around a link, but Cuban scientists would always tell us, we'd love to be published in the US, but we can't access journals there. And it was actually a really big deal for them professionally and personally to be able to publish. So we approached the Bulletin of Marine Science in the University of Miami. They basically said, we're not allowed to. The embargo doesn't allow us to publish Cuban scientists. And they were actually wrong. The embargo had been interpreted much earlier than that to allow, because of the First Amendment, to allow journals to actually publish Cuban authors. So I'm a lawyer. So I teamed up with another lawyer, and we talked to the University of Miami. And believe it or not, they said, wow, thank you for telling us. We didn't realize that. We truly didn't think we would succeed. And then they said, well, why don't we do a special issue on Cuba? And so we did. It took about 2 years to assemble, but there are 9 or 13 articles in this special issue, co-authored by American and Cuban scientists. The Miami Herald said this is the end of the academic embargo, and this was just a few years ago. So there's, again, real power in these scientific collaborations. Also, out of that Bulletin of Marine Science publication, Cuban officials took note that Goliath grouper populations off the south coast are in trouble, and they stepped in and so almost unilaterally imposed a prohibition on fishing of all kinds for Goliath grouper. This is one that I've dived with in the Gardens of the Queen. As I mentioned before briefly, in 2019, Cuba passed a new fisheries law, the first of its kind that really injected science and conservation into it. And we're in the process of working with them to implement that. But we're also, in doing that, we're facilitating exchanges between Cuban fishermen and officials and people in Belize, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere, who are all sort of addressing the same issues of multi-species fisheries management. How do you do it? And how do you do it in a way that's well integrated with place-based measures like marine protected areas? So again, Cuba's sort of influence is much greater than their own borders. And then where does collaboration go from here? EDF is working on a new fisheries project, again, focused on implementing multi-species fisheries management in the face of climate change, how you manage fish stocks together as opposed to separate species. And then we're doing, we're looking at how Cuba is affected by climate change, the vulnerability of their habitats and fish populations, and trying to sort of factor that into management. Here was the event a few weeks ago in DC that David came to, but we, on the second from left, the shorter guy in black is Cuba's most famous actor. He's very active now. He was Oscar nominated back in the 90s for a film called Strawberry and Chocolate. And he's also a director. And he heard about Cuba's Gardens of the Queen. He wanted to go. He told the lead scientist there, if you find a way to get me there, I'll make a film about it. We heard about it right after he filmed, but ran out of money basically. So we co-produced the film. It's a wonderful 40-minute documentary on the science taking place in the Gardens of the Queen. This is the poster. We're hoping to distribute it in the US, and it's now on YouTube as of yesterday. So we'll make sure everyone gets a copy. But I bring this up because as an NGO, part of our mission is to facilitate cooperation on science that informs decent policy making. And it's not always that easy to do, as you could tell from the presentation. Part of the way we do that is through communications. We've taken the New York Times to Cuba, we've taken Discovery Channel, but we want the world to know that Cuba is something more than communism and cigars and old American cars, and that there is a critical need for the U.S. and Cuba to cooperate on a number of issues, including the environment. We found that film is really an effective way of doing that. So we're beginning to combine the arts and sciences more than we have in the past, truly just to kind of get that word out. And this is actually a picture taken, that's me and a couple other colleagues in the Gardens of the Queen. That's the scientific research station, and that's from the New York Times article. And it's, whenever I'm stressed, I always think about that back porch in the Gardens of the Queen. So let me stop there and maybe open it up. I think we have more time, for questions, discussion. And I'm going to stop screen sharing here. Okay, so I'll check the chat.
Yeah, Dan, probably the chat's going to be the easiest way to ask questions. But I'll start off with a question real quickly. Just so in case any of our faculty or graduate students wanted to begin doing research in Cuba, how would they be able to work with EDF to make that happen?
So yes, so if you're starting from scratch, if you've got a research interest in Cuba, the best way to start is to identify, who in Cuba is doing that kind of work, you need a collaborator basically. So if you want to do research in Cuba of any kind, really you need a collaborator. So I invite anyone who does want to do that to reach out to me, and I can orient you on how to do that. It's pretty hard to just send an email cold to, the lead marine scientist on whatever. Sometimes that works, but the most effective way to do it, the way we did it, is to attend a conference in Cuba. Every 3 years they have an International Marine Sciences Conference. I went to one in the year 2000, gave a paper on marine and coastal policy in the U.S., and immediately met all kinds of people who wanted to work together. So in other words, you need to, if you can, find an excuse to go there. If you're there in person, then it's really easy to meet people. And then when you start talking to scientists, they get excited, you get excited, and then you've done, you've leapfrogged over what can be a very long process. But I'm happy to, conspire with y'all and give you some tips on how to do that. That 3-year conference should be coming up soon. I don't think it's this year, but it should be next year. But there are other, events, and as private citizens, everyone here can go to Cuba anytime. So again, another way to do it is just to go down and have a more informal introduction to people, and then take it from there. So one of the questions is what initially sparked my interest in law, and then later in environmental law in Cuba. I'll try to keep it short. It's a long answer, but basically, I grew up in the outdoors on a farm in Kentucky, then moved to New Hampshire, went to school at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee, and really got into the outdoors and wanted to do something in environmental policy. Was a guide in Alaska for a couple of years, and then went to law school in Boulder, Colorado, and then that was it. I really wanted to work on natural resources policy. Cuba's an accident, actually. I practiced in DC and then came to North Carolina and joined EDF after a couple of years. And we actually were focused on fisheries in the South Atlantic US. So North Carolina, Florida, working with federal fishery councils. And we hired a scientist, an ichthyologist in Miami, who said, we can't succeed in the US unless Cuba's doing its part. And he had done some science in Cuba. So that we're like, oh, cool, let's go to Cuba. So he got us invited to this conference, and I had always wanted to go to Cuba. I think I was born during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and was just always fascinated, but I really expected this would be a single trip to Cuba. And when I was there, I met environmental lawyers who had just written over the previous 3 to 4 years a suite of new environmental laws and policies that were very impressive. And so they said, why don't you work with us, to figure out ways to, implement these laws. And so that was basically, it was completely accidental. And I've been doing it for 22 years. Biggest challenge that Cuba faces regarding their living natural resources. A lot of challenges. Cuba is in dire straits. The economy is in terrible shape. People are migrating, more than, since the early 90s when their last really deep economic crisis. So, as many people have said to me over the years, Cubans are basically environmentalists. We get climate change. We understand that we live on an island that's really spectacular, but our pressing concerns are breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's really true. And so there are all kinds of environmental issues, waste management, polluted water and air. But so the biggest challenge is our resources. They've got good scientists, but many of the scientists are leaving. So it's funding, it's resources, it's international support, it's attention. But the opportunities they have is that they place a premium on science. They've got a lot of good information on their own biodiversity. They understand how climate change will affect the island. So they've got a lot going for them already, and a certain pride in what they've already done. So, and they also understand that building out the economy with tourism really depends upon protecting the natural resources. So let's see. Where are their scientists going? Well, a lot of people are just, leaving if they can. A lot through Central America and Mexico. But if people have an opportunity, some people get a trip to Canada and they'll stay. But I know several scientists I've worked with who are now in Miami or in Florida or elsewhere. They found opportunities. Some of them are able to still work in Cuba. That's a handful of those. But yeah, it's just scientists like everyone else are just worried that that the economy is not going to get better. There are a lot of government issues, of course. The government tends to reform very slowly, and people are kind of fed up. Plus, there are power outages that are extremely dire right now. So it's just one thing on top of another. Because of the tensions has it become harder to work for the U.S. government after doing work in Cuba? No. The U.S. government and the Cuban government actually look at what EDF and other groups like us are doing as very beneficial. Cuba is trying to keep the door open to, they welcome collaboration, and they see a group like ours as, reasonably influential in the U.S. The U.S. government kind of likes what we're doing, at least, the career people in the State Department in NOAA and elsewhere, because we're able to do work that they're not able to do. So in other words, we keep the door open to future collaborations. We maintain relationships. We do important research. So it's with that exception of a few politicians in Florida that occasionally take pot shots at people like me, we're not really the target of criticism from the U.S. government. Most people see that it's really mutually beneficial to collaborate on the environment. It's cool that you guys are working with Kristen Kleisner. She's a close colleague of mine, and on the vulnerability assessment, it's a productivity susceptibility analysis. I'm a lawyer, remember that, but it's this, it's a methodology to assess stocks in low data circumstances. So it's something we've done in other countries, including Southeast Asia. But we did it with the fishery managers and the scientists. So, we developed the methodology with them. We trained them in it, and then they basically did it. So the fisheries director in 2014 maybe said to me, Dan, we really understand that overfishing is occurring in the country. We understand it's a problem, but we have, we cannot convince the government to do anything about it because food production is a paramount concern. And so if we're basically arguing to reduce fishing, we've got to back it up with good science. That's when we started working with them on this PSA, this assessment, to basically do a national fisheries assessment. With that data, they were basically able to convince, senior government officials of the need for a fisheries law that kind of rationalized. Plus, they were saying this sort of small, unregulated private fishery was getting out of hand, a lot of black market, and they understood if they didn't do something soon, that fish stocks would be seriously depleted. So we've seen a great sort of receptivity for that. I'll just keep looking at the chat here. So that's a good question. What's our plan? So our plan is, so much of my focus is raising money now. So making sure we're able to interest foundations and donors in the U.S. to continue supporting this work. As I mentioned, MacArthur Foundation supported, Ford and others, but that's not a predictable stream of income. So we have to, fund our work. There are European governments and others that are interested in funding this kind of work. The Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has just funded us and Wildlife Conservation Society to do a project in Cuba. So assuming that we're able to continue to fund, our work will continue to focus on US government and Cuban government relations to try to press Biden administration to do more to sort of re-engage, constructive engagement on the environment and everything else. And then make life easier for people like us and academics to do projects. But our focus will primarily remain on marine and coastal, on fisheries management, on marine protected areas, and increasingly on sort of coastal resilience, working with communities on how to adapt to climate change. We've done a lot of work in Louisiana, now in New York and Virginia around, and Florida around adaptation. But there's a huge opportunity on energy. I co-wrote a report in 2017 on Cuba's electric grid, and it's still the only English language report out there that's a comprehensive look at their sort of challenges and opportunities to modernize the grid and transition to clean energy, which right now is really important. So we're probably going to update that report and possibly develop a project on clean energy in Cuba that sort of works with our work in Puerto Rico on solar energy. So part of our plans are still coming together, but for the next couple of years, we'll have a heavy focus on fisheries. Also, we're producing another film on basically climate change and how how climate change is affecting coastal communities, but also on green entrepreneurs. How is this sort of growing movement in the private sector in Cuba around sustainability? So the last question I see is how do the new fishery management projects ensure that there's still economic opportunity for Cuban workers? That's a really excellent question, and the first answer I have is by including fishermen, by increasing participation, so that they don't simply they're not simply told what the rules are and they're expected to follow them. We're not focused on enforcement, we're focused on compliance. They simply don't have the resources to enforce everything. So how do you foster compliance? And the first way you do that is by giving fishermen and fishing communities and the public a meaningful role in decision making. And we fostered that with our learning network. So in addition to sort of being involved in the process, you're also getting in the same room to learn together. So we're just trying to create that, and on front of everyone's mind is how can I fish less and make more money? And there are a lot of ways to do that in Cuba, actually. One way is sort of a rights-based system, or a turf is territorial use rights for fishing or whatever. where you sort of accord, a share of the catch to certain communities or certain fishers. The other is allow more flexibility in selling fish. So fishermen have to sell to state markets now at a set price. They can't sell legally to private restaurants and tourism operators. So if there's a way that you could ensure that they get more per catch if they are fishing responsibly, you certify basically the catch. There are ways to do that, but that's basically the principal question. I don't think we fully figured it out, but at least the right people are at the table. So how is Cuba managing tourism and these vulnerable marine areas? Cuba has a Ministry of Tourism, and then they have a bunch of sort of state-owned businesses. So if you're a tourist in a marine protected area, if you're going diving, chances are you're going through with a state-owned company. There's an exception to that. There's an Italian company in the Gardens of the Queen, which is the park I mentioned briefly. So it's a concession basically, and they do a really good job of managing the area. But the government's been reluctant to kind of open up the tourism sector to the private sector. You see it with private Airbnbs now, private restaurants, and so ideally over time they will liberalize their policy and allow the private sector to have a piece of the tourism pie that increases the incentive to protect it. There was a lot of concern during the opening, during the Obama opening, about the impacts of tourism, that the temptation will be too great. Cruise ships started going to Havana. There's a lot of concern about that, but it brought a lot of money into the country. And so how do you balance that? The environmental ministry has a large role in approving projects. But like any country, behind the scenes, there's a fierce debate on whether environmental rules are too strict. So this will play out if when things open up again in Cuba. This is going to be a debate, that will take place in Cuba. How do you manage the development to really grow the economy without destroying the natural capital? So. And that's what the New York Times wrote this article. They came down with this for a couple of weeks, and back in 2015. But that was the question they posed: is now that things are opening up, is the environment going to be swept aside? That's why we need to keep scientists and people in country who really have the know-how and who are committed.
Okay, if you have any more questions, now's the time to type them out, please. If you noticed, actually in the chat, I posted both the link for the Bulletin of Marine Science, the special issue that Dan was talking about, and then I also posted the link to the film about the Gardens of the Queen. So if you have any questions or problems getting those, I'm happy to pass those on. Well, I wanted to thank you, Dan, for your time. I appreciate your nice presentation and the possibility of doing work in Cuba in marine issues. If I'm able to help foster any connection between some of the folks here and Dan, let me know. Dan and I know some of the same people in Cuba through the foundation, the Antonio Nunez Jimenez Foundation. But I think he knows far more of the people in marine sciences than I do. So thank you again all for your time. Have a great Friday and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.